I doubt it very much. I mean, there has to be something, because the private sector created such a catastrophe that, as usual, they're going to have to call in the public to bail them out. I mean, that happens over and over. I mean, it happens to be kind of striking now for one reason, because it's such a deep crisis, and because it happens to be the financial industries. Usually it's manufacturing industry that's bailed out by the public. In fact, that's the norm in history. If you look at economic history, I mean, there are studies of this. You know, you take a look at the Fortune 500. I mean, the norm among them is regular bailouts by the government because, you know, they get into trouble and the taxpayer bails them out. And that's only the beginning of what the state does for them. It also is pretty much in charge of research and development, procurement, all sorts of other devices to keep the private economy going. So now they're in trouble, so there's going to have to be more public intervention. But there's no indication that it's moving towards popular control of these institutions, even shares in the banks, voting shares. Like in Europe, there have been voting shares.
Do you see it as moving towards greater control?
What's happening, I mean, it's mostly under wraps, so you don't really know the details. But what's coming out looks like patchwork to get them back to the point where they can, where the private tyrannies can run the economy again without interference, just with the public subsidizing them. I mean, the basic principle of our economy is that the public pays the costs and takes the risks, and profit is privatized. And now it's kind of extreme because you see it right in your face every day, but it's the way it goes on all the time. Now, if you use a computer, for instance, you know, they were developed in the public sector for, again, about 30 years before they were profitable. You take an airplane, you know, it's a modified bomber. You know, in fact, the things that go on in the international economy are just comical. I don't know how economists can look and not crack up and laugh. I mean, I suppose the biggest civilian export, or close to it, is civilian aircraft. And there's constant battles going on in the World Trade Organization between Europe and the United States about, there's two companies now in this competitive economy, Boeing and Airbus. So Airbus is subsidized by Europe and Boeing is subsidized by us. And there's constant battles about who's violating the World Trade Organization's rules worse by the kinds of subsidies they're giving. And all kind of lawyers and economists are writing position papers on whether this subsidy outweighs that subsidy. But it isn't even close to a market economy. I mean, you know, and that's typical. I mean, the high-tech industry is mostly oligopoly, and it's mostly state subsidized in one fashion or another. Is that going to change? Probably not. It's too valuable for the private sector. Will there be any degree of public control? Well, probably not, because that interferes with private tyrannies, and that's the way the system's built. There's no indication in the Obama campaign of any interest in changing this. They just take a look at his advisors. I mean, he himself has said almost nothing, so you really don't know. But if you look at the advisors, we know what they've done, what they believe. There was another part to your...
The second part of that was the use of media.
Oh, the use of media. Well, you know, as I said, Obama did win the Advertising Age Award for the best marketing campaign of the year. That's use of media. You know, it's use of media to delude people, to control them, to make them feel good, to make them feel you love them, and so on. And we see it every day. It's on the front pages every day, if you look. So like yesterday, I guess it was, Biden gave a foreign policy address. It was all over the front pages. It's much more how it's changed since the Bush years. He was very conciliatory. He reached out his hand to Iran and Russia. You know, it's going to be peace and love from now on. And then you look at what he said. Okay, what did he say? Well, with regard to Russia, he reached out his hand and then said, we're going to go on building the so-called missile defense system on your borders. It was a terrible provocation to Russia. I mean, they're not stupid enough to think that those systems are built to stop a non-existent missile from Iran, you know. I mean, furthermore, even if Iran had missiles and nuclear weapons, the chances that they'd attack Europe are kind of invisible, you know. I mean, unless they had a death wish, the minute they armed a missile, they'd be wiped out, you know. So there's no threat of an Iranian missile to Europe or to the United States, even if they did exist. The missile systems there are just a potential threat to the Russian deterrent. That's what missile defense is. It's a first strike weapon. Missile defense is not, nobody ever thinks that even if it ever works, it's not going to stop a first strike. Conceivably, it could stop a retaliatory strike in some, imagined future. So it's a first strike weapon. And strategists on both sides understand that. Okay, you're building them right on Russia's borders. What are they supposed to think? They can read American strategic arms control journals, and that'll tell them what to think. They'll tell them it's a threat to your deterrent. But so this is just a provocation. It's going to increase tensions. I mean, they're going to respond with more weapons, and we march on to Armageddon. So that's what Biden's conciliatory steps were to Russia. What about Iran? Again, we'll be willing to talk to you. You just have to meet one condition. Namely, you have to agree in advance to everything that the negotiations are about. I mean, that's exactly what he said. He said you have to stop as soon as you stop your illicit nuclear programs, we'll be willing to talk to you. Well, that's what the negotiations are about. And what are their illicit nuclear programs? Well, as far as we know, they don't have any weapons programs, at least if you believe U.S. intelligence. There was a national intelligence estimate about a year ago, which stated with what they called high confidence that Iran has not pursued nuclear weapons for about 5 or 6 years. Okay, maybe nobody liked that. The government here didn't like that, so it therefore disappeared, and the media, it disappeared too. So now they're pursuing weapons programs, whatever the facts are. As far as we know, they're producing nuclear energy. But why is that illicit? I mean, they're signers of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Non-Proliferation Treaty grants signers the right to produce nuclear energy. When you read about it here, you read that they're violating the will of the international community. Who's the international community? I mean, it's the United States and anyone who agrees with it. Most of the world thinks they have that right. So the non-aligned countries, which is, most of the world, they think Iran, they forcefully repeat over and over that Iran has the right to develop nuclear energy. But they're not part of the international community because they don't agree with Washington or the New York Times editorial board. What about the American population? Well, the last polls that were taken, about, I think, maybe 3/4 of the population agrees with the non-aligned movement, that they have a right to produce nuclear energy. Okay, they're not part of the international community. The international community is Washington and the editorial board, okay. And they say it's illicit, so therefore Biden says it's illicit. And we won't have any discussions with them until they abandon it. And of course, that's the thing that the discussions are about. So that's the olive branch to Iran. But the wording is nice. I mean, you're right about that. The rhetoric is different. It's not like John Bolton, kick people in the face and so on. It'd be pleasant. And the Europeans kind of like that because they would love to support the United States. It's their highest goal is to be able to shine Washington's shoes. But they couldn't do it with the Bush administration around because they were too brazen and arrogant and unpleasant and so on. And now they've got this nice Harvard graduate, speaks in sentences. So now they can do it. They're very happy, so they can go along with the United States, just like they did in Gaza. But you're right about the rhetoric. The rhetoric is quite different. That's the effect of good PR agents.
Professor, I'm interested, what changes, if any, do you envision occurring in the United States with concern to race and racism now that we've elected an African American to our presidential seat?
It should have an effect. I mean, I should assume that it would change the aspiration level and self-image of large parts of the African American community, but don't exaggerate it. I mean, take a look at South Africa, okay, which is quite an interesting case. I mean, the overcoming apartheid was a tremendous achievement, and they really had to fight.